The first signs that the conflict had entered a far more dangerous phase did not come from the front lines. They came from the sky over Tehran, and from the sudden glow of burning fuel depots lighting the horizon of one of the most heavily defended capitals in the Middle East. Late Saturday evening, Israeli strike aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace and began targeting oil storage and fuel distribution facilities inside the country's capital. According to statements released by the Israeli military, the strikes focused on infrastructure believed to be supplying both civilian networks and military logistics, including fuel reserves connected to Iran's armed forces. The attacks marked a clear escalation. This was no longer limited to proxy battles, covert operations, or isolated missile exchanges. Strategic resources were now on the target list, and oil in Iran is not just an industry, it is the backbone of the state itself. Israeli officials described the operation as part of a new phase of the war, one designed to weaken Iran's ability to sustain long-term military operations across the region. Behind the scenes, senior Israeli sources indicated that planners believed the moment was right to intensify pressure after what they called a significant shift in control of the airspace over western Iran. In a recorded statement released shortly after the strikes, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Israeli and American forces had achieved what he described as almost complete control of the skies over key parts of the battlefield. For military analysts, that claim carried enormous weight. Air superiority is often the turning point in modern warfare. Without it, supply lines falter, command structures become vulnerable, and the ability to coordinate large-scale retaliation begins to collapse. But Netanyahu's statement went further. He warned that the strikes on fuel facilities were only the beginning, and that many more targets, and what he called surprises, had already been prepared. Those words echoed far beyond Israel and Iran. Across the Persian Gulf, air defense systems were already active. Radar screens lit up in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates as waves of drones and missiles moved through the region overnight. Some were intercepted before reaching their targets. Others triggered alerts that forced civilian flights to divert and military bases to move to higher levels of readiness. The pattern of attacks suggested a coordinated response, but the message coming from Tehran was anything but unified. Only hours before the strikes, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian had issued an unusual public apology to neighboring Gulf nations, acknowledging that recent missile launches toward American installations in the region had created tension with countries Iran did not want to confront directly. In his remarks, Pezeshkian suggested that Iran had no intention of expanding the conflict beyond its current boundaries, unless Iran itself came under direct attack. But by the time Israeli jets were striking targets in Tehran, other voices inside Iran's leadership were sending a very different signal. In an interview broadcast on Iranian state television, senior security figure Ali Larijani accused Washington of dragging the region into a war built on what he called a catastrophic miscalculation. Larijani argued that the United States believed it could pressure Iran the same way it had pressured smaller states in the past. By combining economic sanctions, political isolation, and limited military strikes until the government collapsed under internal strain. Instead, he said, the strategy had trapped the United States in what he described as a quagmire of its own making. The contrast between those statements revealed something deeper than disagreement. It hinted at fractures inside Iran's power structure, fractures that many analysts believe have widened since the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, whose absence left competing factions struggling to define the country's next move in the middle of a war that was expanding faster than anyone had predicted. While the political messages grew more uncertain, the military situation on the ground became more violent. In Lebanon, Israeli forces carried out a rare cross-border raid in a mountainous region near the frontier, searching for the remains of a pilot missing since an earlier confrontation. Lebanese authorities reported that dozens of people were killed during the operation, though details remained unclear as fighting continued in nearby villages. The raid signaled that Israel was willing to conduct direct ground operations beyond its borders even as the air campaign intensified. Hours later, explosions shook central Beirut, not in the southern suburbs usually associated with Hezbollah's strongholds, but in the heart of the city itself. According to Lebanese officials, an Israeli strike hit a hotel where intelligence sources believed senior operatives linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard were meeting. At least 4 people were killed and several others wounded, marking one of the few attacks in recent weeks to hit a location far from the traditional front lines. The Israeli military later described the operation as a precise strike targeting commanders connected to the Quds Force, the elite unit responsible for coordinating Iran's network of regional allies. Each of these events, the oil strikes in Tehran, the missile alerts across the Gulf, the raid in Lebanon, the bombing in central Beirut, might once have been seen as separate incidents. But now they were unfolding in the same 48-hour window, forming a pattern that suggested the conflict was entering a far more dangerous stage. And behind every decision, every strike, every warning stood a larger question that no government involved was willing to answer publicly. Was this still a limited war, or had the region already crossed the line into something much bigger? Because as the smoke rose over Tehran and Beirut, intelligence agencies around the world began to report the same quiet conclusion. Both sides were no longer preparing for retaliation. They were preparing for endurance. And in modern warfare, the moment a conflict shifts from retaliation to endurance is the moment it can stop being a crisis and start becoming a war without a clear end. As the explosions echoed across Tehran and Beirut, the battlefield was not the only place where pressure was building. Inside Iran itself, a quieter but equally dangerous conflict was unfolding, a struggle over who was truly in control of the country at one of the most critical moments in its modern history. The death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei left behind more than a vacancy at the top. It left a system designed around one central authority, suddenly forced to operate without the figure who had balanced its competing factions for decades. Political leaders, military commanders, and security officials were now sending messages that did not always match, and those contradictions were being watched closely by governments across the world. President Masoud Pezeshkian appeared to signal restraint when he apologized to Gulf nations for recent missile and drone attacks near American bases in the region. His statement suggested Iran wanted to avoid widening the war and had no intention of targeting neighboring countries unless it was directly threatened. For diplomats, the message sounded like an attempt to calm a region already on edge. But only hours later, remarks from senior advisor Ali Larijani painted a very different picture. Speaking on state television, Larijani argued that the United States had dragged itself into a conflict it did not fully understand. He claimed Washington believed Iran could be pressured the same way other governments had been pressured in the past, through sanctions, limited strikes, and political isolation, but instead had triggered a confrontation that could not be easily contained. Those mixed signals raised a troubling possibility. Iran was not speaking with one voice. For military planners in Israel and the United States, uncertainty inside Iran could be as dangerous as strength. A divided leadership can lead to unpredictable decisions, sudden escalations, or actions taken by commanders who believe they must prove their resolve. At the same time, Israeli officials continued to insist that the campaign was far from over. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu repeated that more targets had already been selected, and that control of the airspace over parts of Iran had opened the door to operations that would have been impossible only weeks earlier. Behind those statements was a growing belief among analysts that the conflict was shifting into a war of endurance, the kind of war where victory is measured not in days or weeks, but in how long each side can keep fighting without breaking. And as intelligence reports circulated through Washington, Tel Aviv, and European capitals, one conclusion kept appearing in classified briefings. Neither side looked ready to stop, and the longer the war continued, the greater the chance that more countries would be pulled into it.